Ancient South Florida lies in an interesting middle ground of the indigenous cultural landscape of North America. Connected to the eastern woodlands, but also very close to the Caribbean world, its cultures thrived in a unique environment. The most famous of these cultures is the Calusa. The Calusa were a highly complex, stratified society with paramount kings and all the pomp, ceremony, and politics that comes with them. Now, that alone doesn't sound all that impressive. We've seen many examples of similarly complex societies on this channel, but what makes the Calusa so interesting is that they, as far as we can tell, practiced no maize agriculture like their woodland and Mississippian brethren to the north. Instead, the Calusa successfully capitalized on the bounty of the sea and the coastline. Even more impressive is that they proved to be especially resilient against Spanish colonial efforts through a combination of shrewd diplomacy and ferocious warfare. For over 200 years, they successfully preserved their independence. These qualities have made the Calusa very enigmatic to scholars for decades, and today we're going to explore this fascinating people and culture. This episode is brought to you by my amazing patrons. Making these episodes is not easy, and it couldn't be done without their support. They actually selected this topic, so all you Floridian viewers that have pestered me over the years about covering the Calusa, please direct your thanks to them. If you, dear viewer, would like to support the show and suggest and vote on topics, you can do so on Patreon. Now on with the show. Before we get started, it's important to take stock of our sources for this episode. The most valuable sources we have are Spanish accounts written by a variety of officials, priests, and explorers. These come over the course of a very long time period, stretching from the early 16th century to the middle of the 18th. Fortunately for us, some of these Spaniards even lived among the Calusa, so some of these are very detailed accounts. By the way, if you ever read Spanish accounts, they will refer to the Calusa as the Kalos, Calus, Calusa, and most frequently and frustratingly, Carlos. Oh, and to make things even more confusing, the Calusa ruler was often referred to as Carlos. Thank you, colonial Spanish writers, for making my job as easy as possible. But what about the Calusa themselves? Did any of them leave any first-hand accounts? Unfortunately, the Calusa culture is now extinct. Their descendants have assimilated into other groups, and no Calusa writer ever wrote a history of their people or home, or at least if they did, it has not survived. Not ideal, but hey, it's what we have. Now, colonial accounts are not the only sources available to us. Since the late 19th century, there has been a steady stream of archaeological study in southwest Florida that has yielded very fascinating results and beautiful artifacts. This has also helped scholars corroborate colonial accounts about the Calusa. Let's start things off by discussing the development and evolution of the Calusa and their predecessors. The Calusa were products of their environment, and, to understand them, we need to zoom in and examine the West Florida coast, specifically the area spanning from Charlotte Harbor all the way down to the 10,000 Islands. The Calusa made the most of a rich coastal environment, teeming with an array of plants and animals. Estuaries in particular were very rich environments that the Calusa and their ancestors had successfully exploited for thousands of years. For those who have heard about estuaries but don't really know what they are, estuaries are bodies of water where fresh water flows from the land and mixes with the seawater. These estuaries on the west coast of Florida are characterized by mangroves, as well as mudflats and salt flats that disappear with the coming and going of the tides. Many marine organisms depend on these estuary habitats at different points in their lives, which in turn attract other predators, and as we'll find out, people. These estuaries would have been prodigious sources of fish, crabs, shellfish, aquatic turtles, and waterfowl. Now, don't get the idea that these estuaries are eternally bountiful, predictable environments. They are actually sensitive environments that exist in a state of flux over the long term. The rising and falling of sea levels triggered by various climactic periods could completely change the local landscape. We aren't talking about massive changes that we see from the melting of ice caps and glaciers, but rather subtle changes from various warming and cooling episodes throughout history. For example, over the past 2,000 years, water levels have fluctuated as much as 1 meter, which admittedly doesn't sound like a big deal, but in those shallow estuaries we mentioned, a few feet off the sea level can push out the coast and dry out huge swaths of mudflats and completely transform the fishing scene. Even something as simple as a very rainy year could change the salinity of the estuary and impact the wildlife. These changes would have forced locals to adopt new subsistence strategies or to find new areas to live. Thus, the Calusa environment was paradoxically stable for certain periods and also continuously changing with climatic fluctuations. Keep this in mind because we're going to come back to it later. Now that we understand the environment, let's take a look at the cultural evolution of South Florida so that we can appreciate where the Calusa came from. Human occupation in Florida can be dated to over 14,000 years ago in the Paleo-Indian period, but the earliest Paleo-Indian sites are confined to the northern half of the state, so it's difficult to say much about the period in southern Florida. It is worth noting that South Florida would have been much larger due to lower sea levels, but with the recession of the glaciers, the sea level rose, giving us the familiar coastline that we see today. This also coincided with a steady shift towards a wetter and more humid environment. One of the earliest well known sites in South Florida is the Cutler Fossil Site, a sinkhole that yielded the remains of Pleistocene animals as well as later archaic human remains and artifacts. The stone artifacts dated to between 12,000 and 10,000 years ago are interesting because the tools were made with chert from quarries over 200 miles away, showing that these people were highly mobile and were able to transport or acquire materials from very far distances. Another important Paleo-Indian site much closer to the Calusa domain is the Warm Mineral Springs, another sinkhole where preserved human remains, bone tools, shell tools, stone tools, animal bones, nuts, and charred wood have been dated to 11,000 years ago at the earliest, showing that the local people were using a wide array of tools, including shell, which is going to become important down the road. During the Middle Archaic from 5000 to 3000 BCE, we begin to get a much clearer picture of human activity in southwest Florida in the archaeological record. At this time, large shell middens were beginning to appear. A shell midden is a mound made up of discarded mollusk shells, and their presence is a strong indicator for long and repeated human presence. These are very important in archaeology because they also preserve artifacts and remains very well, so archaeologists can glean a lot of information by studying them. By this time, that shift towards a wet, humid climate was more or less complete, and there's an important change that we see among the people living in southwestern Florida at the time: the shift to maritime sustenance. I imagine that people were likely making use of coastal resources in earlier times, but this is where it really comes into focus. One of the best sites that illustrates this is the Usepa Island site, located in the Pine Island Sound, which would later become an important part of the Calusa core area. This site, dated to about 4000 BCE, has a smorgasbord of seafood remains. This shows us that the rich estuary environment was already being exploited intensively for thousands of years. Not only that, they were also consuming a variety of plants. One plant that stands out in these assemblages are gourds. Their presence is noteworthy because these suggest that net fishing was already being employed. The hollow gourds would have been used as net floats. People there were also crafting and using large gastropod columella hammers. As cool as this is, we need to clarify something important. This site was not permanently inhabited. This was a seasonal site, meaning that the inhabitants would spend large parts of the year in the Florida interior and then come to the coast to take advantage of the fishing for part of the year before packing up. Kinda like how most of us only go to Red Lobster to take advantage of the ultimate endless shrimp deals before returning to our normal diets. This is evident because tools recovered on the coast were coming from interior sources. That, however, was going to change as the Archaic period continued and these people would come to depend more heavily on the coast for their sustenance. By the late Archaic, evidence of year-round occupation began to appear on the coast. A well-documented example is the Horse Island site, which dates to 2800 BCE. Archaeology shows that people were living in small circular homes made of poles and thatch. By 2000 BCE, we see the earliest fiber-tempered pottery in the southwest coast in the archaeological record. Later, the coastal groups would begin making a simple pottery referred to as sand tempered plain that would persist for centuries. As I've said before, pottery is usually an important development because it usually indicates that people are becoming more sedentary and that food storage is becoming a higher priority. At 500 BCE, there's a noticeable change in the archaeological record that signaled the end of the Archaic and the beginning of the Caloosahatchee culture along the southwestern Florida coast. The Caloosahatchee chronology is divided into 6 periods. Caloosahatchee 1 through 5, but there's a 2A and a 2B just to make things interesting and to give us 6. I'm not going to cover each period in detail. Instead, we'll keep a broad view and point out the important changes and developments. That said, I do want you to be aware in case you ever decide to read up on the topic. The Caloosahatchee period and the eponymous culture are where archaeologists can confidently identify the ancestors or predecessors of the Calusa. We see the beginnings of well-known Calusa sites, tools, and pottery. Speaking of pottery, one important change that we see on the coast is that around 500 BCE, people began to imitate or recreate a style of pottery from the Lake Okeechobee area called Belle Glade Plain. This suggests that populations on the coast were having more interaction with the interior people near Lake Okeechobee, or that people from that area had migrated to the coast and had taken up residence there. We also see an intensification of human occupation with the accumulation of shell middens at different sites. One of these, the Pineland site, located on Pine Island in Charlotte Harbor, shows that by 500 CE, the inhabitants were permanently living there year round, and that several mounds at the site were being constructed that had small circular structures built on top of them. Mound Key, further south in Estero Bay, shows similar patterns of shell midden accumulation. Remains of foreign pottery from these sites also show that these inhabitants were exchanging goods with their neighbors. This was a time of impressive population growth. Although there's no reliable way to establish growth figures, some experts have estimated that the population of the Charlotte Harbor and Estero Bay regions was about 4,800 people. Things would change, however, when the Roman warm period came to an end around 400 CE and the global climate began to cool. This caused sea levels to drop over a meter during the next few centuries. Remember what I said earlier. These shallow estuary waters are sensitive to change, and a 1 meter drop would have greatly impacted the fishing scene over time by pushing fishing and spawning grounds further and further away. In fact, the lower water levels had such a profound effect on the estuaries that some sites, such as Pineland and Mound Key, were even abandoned between 800 and 900 CE. To be clear, there were still people inhabiting Charlotte Harbor, but they were inhabiting other sites with better access to fishing. Usepa Island, for example, has extensive deposits, which suggests that people relocated there to be closer to deeper waters. Now, we have to pause here really quick, because this moment appears to be something of a turning point. It marks a trajectory of increasing complexity and growth, because there's some interesting changes during the cooling period. One visible change can be seen in the remains of houses. Small family dwellings began to be replaced by large multifamily buildings. Archaeologists believe that this new housing pattern was part of a reorganization, which was a response to the environmental changes in the wake of the sea level drop. They theorize that families had to pool their labor and carefully coordinate fishing and foraging efforts to make the most of their diminishing resources. Thankfully, conditions began to improve again after 850 when the medieval warm period started getting underway. Not only did that mean that things were warming up and getting wetter, but also that sea levels were rising again and enriching those dried out estuaries. Formerly abandoned sites like Pineland and Mound Key were reoccupied after 900 CE as other sites further out, like Estero Island, were abandoned as people relocated. Now ask yourself a question. What happens when people have been forced to be thrifty with their resources and then are suddenly flooded with the bounty of the sea on their doorstep? Those thrifty practices net you surplus food and, by consequence, surplus labor. That surplus labor can be put to other uses. So it shouldn't be a huge surprise that at this time they started building on a monumental scale. We'll go into more detail on these constructions later, but this is where they really begin to take off in the archaeological record. To use the Pineland site as an example, several new mounds were constructed after 900, And these mounds were built with a very different paradigm. Previous mounds at the site had been constructed parallel to the shore, but the new mounds were built perpendicular to the shore, likely to face the canal that was being constructed through town. These later Caloosahatchee periods are where we can really start talking about the Calusa in earnest. The centuries between 800 and 1500 are marked by an increasing population, social complexity, and a rise in monumental architecture and public works. One additional factor that may have motivated this organization was increased rivalry with neighboring groups. Judging from pottery remains, there also seems to be an expansion of Calusa territory into the Thousand Island region to the south. By the time the Spanish encountered the Calusa, it's estimated that the entire Calusa domain was home to 20,000 people. But how exactly were all these people living and sustaining themselves? Let's look at what the Calusa were eating. Like their forebears, they were fishing, hunting, and foraging their way to success. Archaeology has shown that more than 30 species of fish, such as pinfish, herring, catfish, mullet, mohara, and pigfish, were consumed regularly. Now, some of you Florida fishing enthusiasts out there might be a bit surprised by that list. Those are fish that are probably more familiar to you as bait rather than as a menu selection. While remains of larger fish like speckled trout, snapper, grouper, shark, and other large marine animals like manatees and sea turtles do appear in the archaeological record, it's very clear that Calusa fishing strategies were aimed at catching lots of small fish, rather than targeting larger fish. To this end, the Calusa employed a variety of approaches to fishing. The most important was net fishing. Nets could be made from palm fiber cords and could be designed to be used for gill netting, seine fishing, and stop nets to trap fish as the tide went out. Fishing weirs could also take advantage of tidal movements to trap fish. The Calusa could also fish larger prey with spears, hooks, and throat gorges, too. Beyond fish, they also harvested over 50 species of mollusks and crustaceans, such as oysters, whelks, crabs, conch, and quahogs. These were important not just for their nutrients and calories, but also because of their shells. In an area that was poor in lithic material, shells were used in place of stone for many tools and decorations. The hard shell of the lightning whelk, for example, made a great tool material, but it also had other applications as well. It was used in containers, burial offerings, net gauges, or carved into engraved whorls, vessels, pendants, beads, earplugs, or gorgets. It's also worth pointing out that the World of Warcraft recognizes this because the lightning whelk axe in that game is a weapon to be reckoned with. Now, a lot of popular literature focuses on the marine aspect of the Calusa diet. It is true that fish and other marine animals were the dietary staples. One estimate stated that 60 to 90% of the meat biomass consumed by the inhabitants of Charlotte Harbor were from bony fish, sharks, and rays. However, that shouldn't blind us from the fact that other game, such as waterfowl, deer, terrestrial turtles, and other small game, were occasionally eaten. Beyond these animals, the Calusa also harvested a wide array of plants for food, crafting, building materials, and firewood. Useful plants include saw palmetto, cabbage palm, cocoa plum, sea grape, pepper, mastic, papaya, hog plum, acorns, mangroves, red cedar, wax myrtle, goosefoot, prickly pear, bottle gourd, hackberry, talinum, mallows, grasses, water lilies, rhizomes, and tubers. Yeesh, that's a lot. Real quick, a few plants in that list are worth commenting on. Plants like squash, bottle gourd, chili peppers, and papaya represent domesticated or semi-domesticated plants that the Calusa would have likely cultivated in small gardens. Archaeologist and Calusa scholar William Marquardt notes that the chili peppers recovered at Calusa sites represent the only chili cultivation in North America east of the Mississippi. Neat. That said, there was no cultivation of maize. This is very unlike the rest of the eastern US, which had embraced maize agriculture by 900 to 1000 CE. I think it's fair to assume that the Calusa were probably familiar with maize, because we do know that other indigenous groups in northern Florida were farming it. Regardless of their knowledge or interest in maize, or lack thereof, the soils in South Florida could not have supported stable maize cultivation, so they had to make do without it either way. This makes the Calusa one of the few cultures in North America to have had a complex, stratified society without a staple crop like maize, manioc, or potatoes. Before longtime viewers head to the comments section, I do want to admit that this isn't totally novel. We've seen similar complexity in other American fishing societies like the people of the Pacific Northwest and the inhabitants of Poverty Point. If you're interested in learning more about those cultures, we do have episodes on them. Nonetheless, it still puts the Calusa in pretty exclusive company. Let's shift to the greater economy. What did trade and exchange look like? We know that the Calusa and other Caloosahatchee people participated in wider trade. Pottery from Lake Okeechobee, as well as from the Central Coast, appear in the archaeology. As I mentioned earlier, good lithic material was hard to come by on the South Florida coast, and this represented a vital import item. Cherts from Tampa Bay appear in archaeological remains, but there are examples of much more exotic materials. Galena, all the way from southeastern Missouri, has been found at the Pinelands site. Although we can't prove it, the Calusa probably played a role in the movement of marine shells into the interior of the continent. Lightning whelk shells have been found as far north as Oklahoma, North Dakota, Kentucky, and even New York. However, Spanish sources note that the Calusa were also able to acquire other products such as mats, hides, and feathers as tributes from their vassals. Speaking of tribute and vassals, what did the Calusa Society look like? Spanish sources report that the Calusa were divided into commoners and nobles. At the top of Calusa society was the paramount ruler, often called the king or cacique in Spanish sources. Just a heads up, cacique was a term for a ruler or chief that the Spanish picked up in the Caribbean. They got into the bad habit of calling any native leader anywhere a cacique. I'm going to refer to the Calusa leader as the king for the rest of the video to keep things simple, but that's not the term that the Calusa would have used, so take it with a grain of salt. The Calusa king was actually the head of a vast tribute and kinship network. Spanish sources report in the 16th century that he had between 50 and 60 vassals and other allies across a wide area, ranging from present-day Cape Canaveral to Lake Okeechobee to modern-day Miami, Florida, and the Florida Keys. This made the Calusa the most powerful people in Florida at the time of European contact. None of this came without violence, and vassals were held in check through intimidation and warfare. The Calusa had a reputation among the Spanish as fierce warriors and had a very intense rivalry with their northern neighbors, the Tocobaca, which colonial sources note often erupted into war. In fact, according to the Spanish, the name Calusa was translated as fierce people, but since the language is not known, we can't confirm that. Take it as you will. One Spanish report from 1680 documented how a mission to the Calusa never even arrived in Calusa territory because their vassals begged the Spanish missionaries to turn back out of fear of reprisal from the Calusa king. These guys didn't mess around. Now, you might expect this martial tradition to be evident in the archaeology of the Calusa and Caloosahatchee culture, but weirdly, there's almost no evidence of warfare in the archaeology, which is a bit paradoxical. No burials with excessive trauma or fortified settlements have been found, like we see in a lot of other cultures. It's possible that this militancy developed just before or after European contact. As far as we can tell, the king rarely led his soldiers personally. Rather, this was often delegated to the Great Captain, as he's called in historical sources. This military leader organized and led warriors into battle at the king's request. Now, the king's role also had religious dimensions as well, because the king was expected to be the link between the Calusa people and the divine realm. Thus, the king's fortunes were closely linked with the prosperity of the land and sea. When the king prospered, so did everyone. I should also note that a chief priest also existed to lead many of the religious ceremonies. We'll discuss Calusa religion in more detail later. The king was permitted to take multiple wives, although Spanish accounts also note that kings were expected to marry their sister, though it's possible that the Spanish misunderstood this and that sister might have meant a clan sister or a parallel or cross cousin. Between you and me, though, I don't think the Spanish had much room to complain, considering that the Spanish Habsburgs were infamous for throwing any and all consanguinity caution to the wind in order to marry their relatives and keep wealth and those big chonky chins in the family. But I digress. So let's take a look at Calusa religion and beliefs. Our knowledge of Calusa religion comes from the accounts of Spanish missionaries, which are pretty biased, and although they lack a lot of detail that I'd like, they are better than nothing. In a letter from Father Juan Rogel to his superiors in 1568, he describes Calusa beliefs in detail, and we quote:
They say that each man has three souls. One is the little pupil, niñeta of the eye. Another is the shadow that each one casts. And the last is the image of oneself that each one sees in a mirror or in a calm pool of water. And that when a man dies, they say that two of the souls leave the body, and that the third one, which is the pupil of the eye, remains in the body always.
He elaborates on this last point later in the same letter.
They have another error also, that when a man dies, his soul enters into some animal or fish, and when they kill such an animal, it enters into another lesser one, so that little by little it reaches the point of being reduced into nothing.
Sounds like a really interesting set of beliefs, but unfortunately, the letter doesn't say anything more. Rats. We know that the Calusa were polytheistic, but we don't have a good understanding of the Calusa pantheon because the Spanish accounts are, again, frustratingly vague. They note that the Calusa had a trio of gods in a hierarchical structure. The highest god controlled the movements of celestial bodies and time, and it's also noted that they were superior to the other two. One gets the impression that he or she was a god over nature or natural forces. The second god, who outranked the third, was said to control the governance of the empires, republics, and kingdoms. Frankly, I'm not entirely sure what this means. Perhaps this god had influence over the affairs of humans? I don't know. The third and lowest god was the god of war, who had the power to bring victory to one side in battle. If you are curious about what the names of these deities were, we have no clue because, again, no account mentions them by name. Okay, that's a bit frustrating, but we also can get some interesting clues about Calusa beliefs by looking at Calusa art that has survived to the present day. Excavations at the Key Marco site in 1895 have revealed stunning pieces of art that were most likely used in ceremonies. Now, I do need to throw out a disclaimer that this isn't technically a Calusa site per se, it's actually a Muspa site, but these people appear to have been absorbed into the Calusa sphere around 1300 when the Muspa adopted Calusa pottery and artifacts. So, the artifacts from this site still give us a great window into Calusa art and ceremony. The Key Mound site is a wet site where anaerobic conditions were able to preserve organic materials that normally would have rotted away long ago. Excavations recovered brightly painted ceremonial masks carved from wood, some with fibers and wrappings still attached. Spanish eyewitnesses to Calusa religious and political ceremonies noted that priests donned masks in processions with singing women. They would have been brightly painted and full of color. Unfortunately, the masks from the Key Marco site were excavated long before modern preservation techniques were available, so the colors have sadly long since faded or disintegrated. Another artifact, this one from the Pineland site, is a portion of a carved bird head that is believed to have been part of a headdress, and many proposed reconstructions exist for it. These works of art showcase not only the Calusa's rich culture, but also their ability as master woodcarvers. The single most famous example of Calusa woodworking is probably the Key Marco cat, a beautifully rendered panther in a seated pose. It's a small miracle that this little guy survived the sands of time. I think it's also worth noting that he foreshadows the future NHL team of South Florida, the Florida Panthers. The Calusa also made carvings from bone and shell, but I didn't see any instances of stone carving during the research for this video. Wood appears to have been the most important material and medium for crafting. On that note, let's take a look at Calusa architecture, because there's a lot more than meets the eye. While it's true that there are no standing Calusa structures, archaeologists can detect post holes in the soil. These are where ancient posts were driven into the ground to support a building. Roofs would have been thatched, although archaeologists are not certain how. Judging from Seminole and Miccosukee houses, it's possible, perhaps likely, that the Calusa used cabbage palm fronds for this purpose. Such buildings are also consistent with how other indigenous people in South Florida lived. The most well attested type that we mentioned earlier are pole and thatch structures built on small mounds or shell middens. Building on mounds provided several advantages. They would have been safe from storm swells, flying insects, and on a really bad day, enemy warriors. The largest mounds can reach up to 10 meters and were likely reserved for elite buildings. Some of these mounds were built on top of old middens, and there's evidence at different sites of recycling old mounds and middens to enlarge new mounds. Judging from colonial sources, most buildings were likely multi-family houses that would have housed different families or extended family units, but that said, I didn't come across any size estimates, so I'm not exactly sure how large these houses were or how many families they would have had. According to historical accounts, some Calusa buildings could be quite large. One account from Gonzalo Solis de Maras in 1566 notes how large the king's house was and how many people could fit in the building.
2,000 men might gather in the cacique's house without being very crowded. Governor Menendez de Avilés entered the cacique's house alone, with about 20 gentlemen, and stood where there were some large windows, through which he could see his men. The chief was in a good-sized room, seated alone with great authority, and an Indian woman, also seated, a little separated from him, at a height of half a rod from the floor. There were also up to 500 noble Indians, and another 500 Indians, the Indian men near him, and the Indian women near the Indian woman. Below her, then, more than 500 Indian girls, from 10 to 15 years old, seated on the outside of the window, began to sing, and the other Indians to jump and whirl, and the noble Indian men and women who were near the chief sang.
That's a big building, although it's worth noting that this structure may have been a council house rather than the king's private home. The remains of this structure have actually been identified on top of Mound 1 of the Mound Key site, and investigations have shown that it was an oval shape and had a diameter approximately 24 meters long along its long axis and a diameter of 20 meters on the shorter axis. That's huge, and it represents the largest known Calusa building and one of the largest pre-Columbian buildings in Florida. Perhaps the most impressive thing that the Calusa built were their canals and waterworks. Canals were important because they provided very easy transportation routes through towns and villages. Today, with LiDAR, we can actually see the remains of these canals on the ground. At the Pineland site, a large central canal was constructed through the middle of the site, connecting several mounds and eventually cutting through Pine Island to the eastern side near a site called the Old Indian Field. The central canal represented an enormous investment of labor. Nobody was using power tools back then. Those canals were dug by hand, and it was probably way worse than what you went through to dig that little koi pond in your backyard. That sucker didn't have to accommodate busy canoe traffic. Estimates suggest that this feature was approximately 9 meters wide, 2 meters deep, and 15 meters from berm to berm on each side. Archaeologists William Marquardt and Karen Walker have conservatively estimated that this would have required moving 30,000 cubic meters of excavated sediments. To put that in perspective, that's equal to the same amount of earth that went into many contemporary Mississippian platform mounds. And that doesn't even represent all the labor costs, because such a canal would have demanded regular maintenance. At Mound Key, a similar canal was constructed that was 10 to 12 meters wide, with smaller canals branching off at right angles. Now, these canals may have had another important function, and to see what, we have to look at water courts. These are large basins dug into the earth that widened the canal at certain points. On a map, they almost look like aquatic plazas or parking lots, and maybe they functioned as areas for canoes to dock without clogging up the traffic. However, archaeologist Victor Thompson has studied these water courts and has identified a very interesting possible use for them. In a study on water courts at Mound Key, he and his associates took soil cores and discovered that after the water court was constructed, the number of fish remains in the cores increased. Comparing the number of remains with cores taken from the open water environment of the bay, they discovered that there were far more fish remains in the water courts, which suggested that these large water courts may have acted as giant fish traps. They theorized that water courts could have been closed with gates or nets to keep the fish trapped for later harvesting. This would have kept a healthy surplus of fresh fish in the center of town. Other excavations found remains of what are believed to be drying and smoking racks. If this theory is correct, it speaks to a brilliant engineering of the environment by the Calusa to ensure that they always had a large supply of fish at their disposal. Absolutely ingenious. In discussing the Calusa, we have to discuss their interaction with the Spanish. The Calusa lived in the shadow of the Spanish Empire for more than 2 centuries and proved equally to be a thorn in their side and a target for colonization and conversion. The first European to encounter the Calusa is believed to be none other than Juan Ponce de Leon in the spring of 1513, he of the Fountain of Youth fame. Before people go to the comments, there's actually no contemporary evidence or writings for him that was the goal of his expedition. It's a legend that grew up after his death. Also, we should mention that we don't know with 100% certainty that the people he met were the Calusa. Historians believe they were, based on Ponce de Leon's reported position and descriptions, but there are a few historians who disagree. Assuming that they were indeed the Calusa, how were Senor Ponce de Leon and his compatriots received by the Calusa? Well, it wasn't very friendly. After expressing some interest in trading with the Spanish, the Calusa, to the surprise of the conquistadors, sent a man who spoke Spanish and advised him that the king wanted to trade and that there was lots of gold in the area. But this ended up being a ruse, and the Spanish were ambushed and engaged in a few skirmishes before licking their wounds and returning to Puerto Rico. Now, this encounter is interesting because it suggests that the Calusa already knew who the Spanish were and what they were after. It's likely that Caribbean people fleeing the Spanish conquest made contact with the Calusa and gave them important intel on the Spanish. One of these refugees may have learned the Spanish language during the conquest. At least that's what the Spanish authors thought. In many ways, this is a very fitting preview of Spanish-Calusa relations. The Calusa proved to be very adept at manipulating the Spanish and using them for their own ends. Not only that, but the Calusa were renowned archers and fierce warriors to the Spanish. One description from Bernal Diaz del Castillo, the same guy who famously chronicled Cortez's conquest of Mexico, sums this up nicely. To quote,
These Indians carried very long bows, and good arrows and lances, and some weapons like swords. And they were clad in deer skins, and were very big men. They came straight on, and let fly their arrows, and at once wounded 6 of us, and to me they dealt a slight arrow wound.
That later description aside, this wasn't the last time that Ponce de Leon encountered the Calusa. Details are a bit sketchy, but he returned in 1521 to found a settlement, ran into the local Calusa, who were just as hostile to the Spanish as before, and in a painful get-off-my-lawn moment, proceeded to get shot by a poison arrow and die of his wounds. Ouch. Subsequent colonial expeditions and misadventures in Florida, such as the famous Narvaez and De Soto expeditions, would confirm to the Spanish that Florida had no gold or easily looted valuables, and that the locals were a pretty intractable bunch. A tradition we should note that has been boldly carried on to the present day by the modern-day Florida man. There must be something in the water, I guess. Even though Florida never had the same allure that drew conquistadors to the great empires of Peru or Mexico, the Spanish still had encounters with the Calusa, and the Calusa did need to be dealt with. See, the west coast of Florida was a particular hotspot for Spanish shipwrecks, and survivors from these mishaps would end up in Calusa hands, where they would remain as captives or be executed. This also gave the Calusa an erratic supply of Spanish goods, tools, and even gold. Thus, the Spanish had an incentive to improve relations with the Calusa. If they could be brought to terms and Christianized, the Spanish would have a much better chance of recovering shipwrecked crew and cargo. In 1566, the Spanish made such an effort under the leadership of Pedro Menendez de Aviles. His goal was to negotiate the release of some Spanish captives, open up relations, begin conversion efforts, and hopefully pave the way for future colonization. Now, when Menendez de Aviles arrived in Calusa territory, he got insanely lucky because he was greeted by a Spaniard named Hernando de Escalante Fontaneda, a castaway who had lived among the Calusa for 17 years and knew the Calusa language and their culture. He actually later wrote about his life among the Calusa, and it's an important document in our understanding of them. But back to Deaviles. After some negotiating with the Calusa king Calus, he was invited back to his town, the site of Mound Key, where he was received hospitably and with pomp. Just a heads up, Calus gets annoyingly rendered in the accounts as Carlos, so if you read up on this, you'll usually see him referred to as Carlos, but I'm going to be calling him Calus. Now, we aren't going to go into full detail on the events of this diplomatic mission here, but it's pretty wild, and I'd encourage you to check the article by Stephen Edward Riley called A Marriage of Expedience in the Bibliography if you want all the juicy details. It's an entertaining read. Instead, we're going to hit the highlights. First of all, Menendez de Aviles got sucked into a power struggle between Calus and his cousin, referred to as Don Felipe in the sources. Calus tried to cement an alliance between himself and the Spanish by marrying his sister to de Aviles. Fun fact, this is the earliest documented marriage in the future United States between a European and an indigenous person. The bride, named Doña Antonia after she was baptized, was soon whisked away to Cuba and became a bit of a hostage and bargaining chip in negotiations with Calus. Even with those tensions between the Calusa and the Spanish, de Aviles managed to establish several forts on the Florida coast, and the Jesuits with him also founded a mission and tried to convert the Calusa. The Jesuits found the Calusa particularly stubborn in their religious convictions, and despite their energy to the mission, the Calusa remained true to their ancestral beliefs. But this honeymoon wasn't going to last. When the Spanish sided with the Tocobaga in a conflict against the Calusa, things began to unravel quickly. Calus would be killed in a coup by his cousin Don Felipe, the Spanish, and several disaffected nobles. Don Felipe was receptive to the Spanish. He had to be to keep himself protected from assassination by Calus's former supporters. Unfortunately, the price of this protection was conversion to Christianity, which Don Felipe knew full well would erode his support among the Calusa, and this eventually caused him to break with the Spanish. After orchestrating some attacks on the Spanish, they would find Don Felipe and execute him. For those curious about Doña Antonia's fate, she was allowed to return to her home, but how she navigated the political storm back there, we don't know. You'd think that this would be a prelude to Spanish annexation, but the Spanish decided to cut their losses and leave the Calusa. Apparently, they felt that maintaining a presence in South Florida just wasn't worth the trouble. After this period, the Calusa appear to have retreated and isolated themselves. After the Spanish withdrew, the Calusa burned Mound Key and relocated their capital back to Charlotte Harbor. From then on, they eschewed almost any contact with the Spanish. They continued living as they had for centuries in their ancestral lands. The Spanish would occasionally reach out to the Calusa to ransom Spanish captives or to renew attempts at evangelization. In 1697, the Spanish missionaries were invited by the Calusa king to set up a mission and preach to the Calusa. But when they arrived, the Calusa seemed to be much more interested in Spanish gifts than converting to Catholicism and adopting agriculture. A Calusa chief at the time is even reported to have told a missionary that if he was not going to give him clothing and food, it was no good to become a Christian, and that no one would want to become one. When the Spanish brought farming tools, the Calusa allegedly asked who was going to till the ground if the Spanish brought no black slaves, implying that they weren't going to do any of that work. However, as the missionaries took stronger and stronger stances against the Calusa's religious practices and beliefs, tensions began to mount among the increasingly furious locals. It's worth noting that when the Calusa resisted missionary efforts to stamp out their religion, they avoided killing or injuring the missionaries, likely well aware that this would trigger a strong Spanish retaliation. Reading about the experience of these missionaries in South Florida, I get the distinct impression that the Calusa wised up to the Spanish goals and exploited them for material gain. After a few months, the mission was abandoned and the missionaries returned home, but not before the locals pilfered their remaining tools and gifts. You're probably expecting me to discuss a conquest of the Calusa by the Spanish, but the end of the Calusa is very unusual. By the early 18th century, the Calusa were still in Charlotte Harbor, chugging along and keeping themselves isolated from the outside world. Unfortunately, the world around them had changed dramatically over the last 2 centuries, and wars between colonial powers were starting to have an impact on them. In Queen Anne's War, British forces attacked several Spanish garrisons and outposts in northern Florida, breaking through and penetrating into northern Florida. This left northern populations exposed to colonial aggression and slave raiding. Southeastern tribes allied to the British colonies, like the Uchis Creek and Yamasee, began raiding into South Florida to capture other natives and to sell them as slaves to the Carolina colonies. These tribes were well armed and well supplied with British muskets, and thus they had a huge advantage over the isolated Calusa. Such attacks and raids took huge tolls on the indigenous population of South Florida and forced the Calusa away from their ancestral lands into the Florida Keys. For some of these beleaguered people, the Spanish, weirdly enough, would prove to be their salvation. In 1711, the Spanish transported 270 Calusa refugees to Cuba, but most died of disease on the voyage, sadly. Later, Spanish sources reported that by 1763, at the end of the French and Indian War, the last remnants of the indigenous people of South Florida were transported to Cuba. Thus, by the middle of the 18th century, Calusa culture had been almost eradicated, with its population being killed by war, stricken by disease, sold into slavery, or fleeing to Cuba and assimilating into the local population. During the research for this video, I tried to find out if any people today claim Calusa descent and could not find any indigenous groups that do. As sad as the Calusa demise is, we should remember that they were resilient in the face of challenges. Prior to their end, they successfully resisted Spanish colonization for over 2 centuries, despite being so close to the Caribbean, the very epicenter of Spanish colonialism. During that time, they continued to live in their ancestral lands, practice their religion, and preserve their political independence. Their beautiful art that still survives speaks to their master craftwork and rich ceremonies. They didn't just survive, they thrived. What makes this all the more impressive is that they did so without any maize agriculture. Eastern cultures, with their great mounds and powerful leaders, were typically fueled by maize, but the Calusa prospered thanks to their ability to harvest the bounty of those rich estuaries along the coast. Their kings were kings of humble fishermen and strong warriors. The Calusa may be gone, but their legacy is one that we shouldn't forget. Their mounds and canals that still remain on the Florida landscape after centuries of neglect and modern development speak to their legacy. Once again, special thanks to my patrons for supporting my work and for selecting this topic. You guys are the best. If you'd like to join the ranks of these fine individuals and support the show, you can do so on Patreon. The link will be in the description. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us on Facebook. Take care, and we'll see you in our next episode.